London, May of 1816. The streets were a grimy shadow of their former selves, still suffocating from the persistent haze of coal smoke and the uncertainty that loomed over the future. It was a morning just before dawn, a time when the city's heart seemed to be still, but the pulse of its undercurrent was felt by those who knew where to look. As the carriage rattled over the uneven cobblestones, the faint light from the street lamps flickered and cast eerie shadows on the walls of dilapidated buildings. Inside the dark carriage sat a young woman, Rosalind Merrick, her knuckles white as she gripped the sides of her seat. Rosalind, barely 20, had grown up in a house filled with books, knowledge, and love. Her father, a well-regarded physician, had taught her to understand the human body in ways that most women of her age could never dream of. But all of that had come crashing down when her father had passed away unexpectedly, leaving her to navigate a world that did not value her intellect, but rather her beauty and marriageability. She stared out the carriage window, knowing exactly where it was taking her. The £40 her mother had received for her was a sum that could change everything. 2 years of living expenses, or the cost of a well-made gown for a lady of quality. But for Rosalind, it was the price of her dignity, the price of her future. Her mother had made it clear. Rosalind had no choice. She had been sold, and there was nothing she could do to escape. The carriage slowly came to a stop, and Rosalind's heart raced as she looked out the window. Mrs. Fletcher's house, a cold, imposing structure, stood before her. There was a light shining in one of the windows, but it was not the welcoming glow of warmth. No, this light was like the beacon of a prison, one that would lock her away for the next year, until she turned 21. By then the law might offer some protection, but for now, she had no other option but to endure. The door of the carriage opened, and a man stepped into view. His face was sharp, commanding, and the sort of face that belonged to someone who had known power. But this wasn't just anyone. This was Adrian Stratford, the Earl of Montrose. "Miss Merrick," he said, his voice firm but kind. "I have been informed of your situation, and I am here to take you away from this." He extended his hand with an authority that made Rosalind's mind spin. "Come with me. You are not bound by this fate." Rosalind's mind raced, unable to make sense of what was happening. This was a world she had never known. An earl, coming to rescue her? It seemed like something out of a dream, but the desperation in his eyes was real. And behind him Mrs. Fletcher, the woman who had paid for her, stood fuming in the doorway. Her hands were clenched tightly, no doubt furious at the interruption to her plans. "I have purchased this girl," Mrs. Fletcher hissed. "You have no right to take her from me." "Purchased?" The Earl's voice was cold, slicing through the tension. "A contract signed to sell a daughter into disgrace is nothing more than a piece of paper. The law does not recognize it, and neither do I." The carriage finally slowed as it approached a grand townhouse, its stone facade gleaming in the early morning light. The doors opened before the driver could even halt the vehicle completely, and a butler stepped forward to greet them. His bow was deep, but his eyes never left the Earl, a silent acknowledgement of the power that had just entered the house. "Miss Merrick," the Earl said as he offered his hand to help her from the carriage. "This is my home. You are safe here for now." Rosalind stepped out, taking in the marble entrance hall with its towering columns and intricate ceiling moldings. Everything about the house screamed wealth, refinement, and power, a far cry from the life she had known. For the first time in a long while, she felt the cold weight of the situation, like an outsider stumbling into a world that wasn't meant for her. The Earl guided her through the hall, and into a small drawing room where a woman sat with a stern, calculating gaze. She was older, in her 70s at least, with silver hair twisted into an elaborate coil, and eyes that seemed to pierce through Rosalind with a single glance. This, Rosalind soon realized, was Lady Constance Stratford, the Earl's grandmother, and the woman who would be the true test of her transformation. Lady Constance didn't stand, but her eyes never left Rosalind as the Earl introduced her. "This is Miss Rosalind Merrick, grandmother," he said with a slight bow, though his tone was anything but deferential. "I am offering her 3 months. If she passes your standards, we will move forward as planned." "Good," Lady Constance said with a smile that was more dangerous than kind. "Then let the transformation begin. Starting tomorrow at 6 o'clock, you will be mine to shape." The next morning, Rosalind awoke early, the weight of her decision settling on her chest like a boulder. She had agreed to this bargain. But now the reality of what lay ahead seemed almost impossible to bear. Her entire life had been about survival, about enduring the worst that life could throw at her. But now, for the first time, it seemed like she had a chance, no matter how slim it might be. As the clock struck 6, Rosalind stood in front of Lady Constance, her hands trembling at her sides. The older woman wasted no time. She gestured for Rosalind to stand taller, to square her shoulders, to fix her posture. For the next 2 hours, Rosalind was made to walk the length of the room with books stacked on her head, each step a battle against the pain that radiated through her spine. Lady Constance's criticism was sharp and unrelenting, but Rosalind didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. Every misstep was met with cold rebuke, but every small victory, a straight posture, a steady step, was quietly acknowledged. The morning passed in a blur of drills and lessons. Rosalind's mind ached with the knowledge she was being forced to absorb, but she pushed herself further, determined not to fail. She had no other choice. As the day wore on, the lessons shifted from physical discipline to intellectual ones. French conversation, Italian literature, the finer points of needlework, and how to conduct oneself at dinner parties. The sheer amount of information was staggering, and Rosalind found herself struggling to keep up. But Lady Constance's voice was a constant, pushing her, demanding perfection. And as exhausting as it was, Rosalind kept going. By the end of the first week, Rosalind was starting to see the cracks in her confidence. The doubts crept in. Could she truly become the woman they wanted her to be? Could she change everything about herself in just 3 months? But each time those doubts rose, she shut them down. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. For every misstep, she pushed herself harder, determined to prove everyone wrong. But there was one moment in the second week that made her question everything. During one of her many lessons, she was asked to play the piano. Rosalind's fingers hovered over the keys, the music in front of her a jumble of notes she couldn't seem to make sense of. The tension in her shoulders was unbearable as she pressed the keys, her mind racing to find the rhythm. But no matter how hard she tried, the music sounded wrong, disconnected, empty. "You fight the instrument," a voice said from the doorway. Rosalind looked up, startled to find Adrian standing there, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I'm trying to conquer it," she admitted, frustration thick in her voice. "But it seems to resist me." Adrian didn't move closer, but his gaze softened. "Music cannot be conquered, only courted," he said. "You approach the keys as if they are a problem to be solved. Try approaching them as a story to be told." Rosalind blinked, confused. "A story?" Adrian nodded. "What are you trying to say with the music? That's where the magic lies. Not in perfection, but in emotion." Rosalind sat back down at the piano, unsure of what he meant. But as her fingers moved over the keys once more, something shifted. The music began to feel less like a task and more like an expression. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in that moment, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about learning the rules. It was about finding her own voice, her own strength. The days blurred together in a haze of learning and exhaustion. Rosalind had never known a pace like this before, and as the weeks passed, she began to feel the weight of the transformation she was undergoing. Lady Constance's training was brutal, demanding nothing less than perfection at every turn. But there were moments, small victories that no one else saw, that kept Rosalind going. The social lessons were perhaps the most difficult. It wasn't just about learning the rules of high society. It was about unlearning everything she had known. As the daughter of a physician, Rosalind had always been taught to observe, to question, and to challenge. In the world Lady Constance inhabited, those were dangerous traits. It wasn't enough to simply know the rules. Rosalind had to internalize them, become them. She had to blend in, smile when she needed to, remain silent when it was expected, and above all, never show the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. One evening, as she stood before the full-length mirror in her room, adjusting her gown for yet another dinner, Rosalind stared at her reflection. She hardly recognized the woman who stared back at her. The girl who had once lived in a modest house in Yorkshire, who had been filled with hope and ambition, was now replaced by someone else. someone who wore the mask of a lady, even when it felt like it might suffocate her. "Don't shrink," Lady Constance's voice echoed in her mind. "Occupy space with authority." It was the constant refrain, the same advice repeated every morning and night. Rosalind had learned to carry herself with grace, to stand tall in any room, to be poised and composed even when her heart was ready to explode. And yet, no matter how much she mastered the external performance, the question remained. Would it ever feel real? The Earl Adrian had been distant. His presence was like a shadow that loomed over every decision, every lesson, every moment of doubt. At first, she had been too consumed by the intensity of her training to notice his absence. But as the days went on, something began to shift. He was always polite, always respectful, but he never crossed the line into something more personal. He remained a figure of authority, a man who had rescued her, but never seemed to offer anything beyond the formalities of his title. Rosalind couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his intentions than simply offering her a chance at survival. It wasn't just that he had taken her in. It was the way he had watched her during their lessons, his gaze occasionally softening, his words laced with something deeper than obligation. And yet, he never allowed himself to show anything more than calculated concern. One afternoon, as Rosalind struggled to balance the intricacies of French conversation with the demands of needlework, Lady Constance entered the room. She stood silently for a moment, watching Rosalind's frustrated attempts to thread a needle, before speaking. "Do you find it difficult, Miss Merrick?" Her voice was as cold as ever, but there was an edge to it now. "Do you still doubt yourself?" Rosalind looked up, meeting the older woman's piercing gaze. "I find it all difficult," she admitted. "But I will not fail." Lady Constance's lips curled into a tight smile. "Failure is not an option. You will succeed, or you will be discarded. You will not have the luxury of doubt, Miss Merrick. That is not a privilege afforded to women like us." The words stung, but Rosalind held her tongue. There was truth in them, and truth was a bitter pill to swallow. She had come to understand that Lady Constance's cruelty was a form of preparation. The aristocracy had no place for weakness, no time for hesitation. It was survival of the fittest, and if Rosalind was to survive in this world, she would have to become something else. A woman who could navigate the most intricate social labyrinths, who could win battles of wit and grace without ever revealing her true self. That night, as she lay in bed, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight, Rosalind's thoughts turned to the Earl. Despite his distance, despite the barriers he had placed between them, there was something about him that intrigued her. She couldn't deny the moments they had shared. Those rare, fleeting instances when their eyes met, when his guard slipped just enough for her to catch a glimpse of the man beneath the title. But what did that mean? Did it mean anything? The thought haunted her as she drifted off to sleep, the weight of the day still pressing on her chest. The next morning, the lessons continued. This time it was dance. Rosalind had learned the basics, the steps, the movements, but Lady Constance was determined to refine her skills to perfection. Every motion had to be fluid, every gesture graceful. Rosalind had no choice but to comply, despite the ache in her limbs, despite the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. By the time the ball came, just 5 weeks into her transformation, Rosalind felt like a different person. She had learned how to present herself, how to speak, how to move. She had become a creature of the aristocracy, and yet, she still felt like an imposter. The ball was to be her first real test, the moment when she would be judged by society. And as she stood at the entrance, her heart racing in her chest, she realized just how much was riding on this night. This was not just about her training. This was about her survival. The Earl stood beside her, his arm extended, his expression unreadable. As they entered the ballroom, the whispers began. Her breath caught in her throat as eyes turned to examine her, to appraise her every movement. She could feel their judgment, sharp and unforgiving. Yet, despite the fear that clutched at her heart, Rosalind stood tall. She had survived so much already. This, she realized, was just another test, another challenge to be overcome. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that not everyone was impressed. Lady Victoria Ashworth, the most eligible lady in the room, watched Rosalind with a look of cold disdain. Rosalind couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze, could feel the scorn that radiated from the woman like an invisible force. And then, in the midst of the gathering, as the music swirled around her, there was a moment. A moment when Rosalind found herself alone, caught between the pressure of social expectation and the reality of her situation. It was then that her mother arrived, uninvited and out of place, her presence a shock to the carefully constructed illusion of Rosalind's life. "Rosalind." Mrs. Merrick's voice sliced through the noise of the ballroom like a knife. "How dare you stand there pretending to be a lady? After everything I did for you, after I sold you for £40, you think you can walk among these people as though you belong?" The words were like a slap, and the room fell into stunned silence. Rosalind froze, her breath catching in her throat. All of her carefully constructed dignity, everything she had worked for, threatened to collapse in an instant. She could see the curiosity in the eyes of the guests, the whispers that began to spread like wildfire. The room had gone completely still. The sharp, accusing voice of her mother rang through the air, each word like a hammer striking an unforgiving anvil. Rosalind stood frozen in place, her mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. How could this be happening? Here, in the very ballroom where she had worked so hard to prove her worth, her mother had appeared uninvited, like a specter from her past, determined to tear everything down. "Rosalind, my own flesh and blood," Mrs. Merrick continued, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. "I sold you for £40 to pay off debts that you helped create. And now you act as if you are some fine lady. You think you can escape from your past, but you'll always be the daughter of a woman who abandoned you." The whispers that followed were like a tidal wave, crashing around her, drowning out the music and the laughter. Rosalind could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the judgment in their eyes as they processed the shocking revelation. She had been nothing more than a pawn in her mother's game, sold to pay off debts, discarded when she was no longer useful. The Earl's hand gripped hers, his fingers steady as if to anchor her in the storm. His presence was the only thing that kept her grounded as her world seemed to collapse in on itself. She could see the shock in his eyes, but also something deeper: anger, protective instinct, perhaps even a hint of guilt. He had brought her here, offered her a future, and now, her mother had destroyed the fragile hope of a new life with a single cruel statement. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment no one moved. It felt like the entire world had come to a halt, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. But then, with an authority that cut through the noise, Adrian stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable edge. "Mrs. Merrick," he said, his words freezing the air between them. "You signed a legal document renouncing all rights to your daughter. The contract is invalid, and the law will protect her from any further exploitation." Mrs. Merrick opened her mouth to protest, but the Earl cut her off before she could speak. "I suggest you take your £40, and consider yourself fortunate that I do not have you arrested for human trafficking. Your actions are beyond reproach, and I will not allow you to drag Miss Merrick through the mud any longer." For a moment, it looked as though Mrs. Merrick would argue, her face contorted with fury, but the Earl's words had a finality to them that left her no room to maneuver. Two of the footmen appeared at his signal, their faces impassive as they gently but firmly escorted Mrs. Merrick from the ballroom. The door closed behind them, and the room erupted into hushed murmurs. Rosalind stood there, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of the moment began to sink in. She had been exposed, her past, her shame, her mother's betrayal, all laid bare for the world to see. And yet, in that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear, the shame, the uncertainty, everything that had held her back seemed to vanish, replaced by something far stronger: resolve. She straightened her back and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who had watched the scene unfold. It would have been easy to shrink away, to apologize for the scandal that had just erupted, but that was not who she was anymore. She was Rosalind Merrick, and she would not be defined by her mother's mistakes or by the whispers of those who did not understand her. The Earl stepped closer to her, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and something else, something unspoken. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he feared the answer. "I'm fine," Rosalind replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've had worse." Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat, a flicker of something deeper than mere obligation. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual guarded composure. Lady Constance, who had been watching the scene with a keen, assessing eye, stepped forward. "Miss Merrick," she said, her voice firm but not unkind, "you've weathered this storm admirably. It's time to move on. The world will always seek to tear you down. The question is, will you allow it to?" Rosalind nodded, feeling a surge of pride at the words. "No, my lady. I will not." And with that, she turned her attention to the rest of the evening. The whispers still echoed in the air, but they no longer had the same power over her. The ball continued, the music playing, the guests dancing, but Rosalind's place in the world had shifted. The evening had been a test, one she hadn't been prepared for, but one that she had survived nonetheless. As the night wore on, the Earl remained by her side, guiding her through the intricacies of aristocratic society, ensuring she was never left alone for too long. There were more dances, more conversations, and even moments of laughter, but through it all, Rosalind couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. But it wasn't until the end of the night, when the carriage arrived to take them back to Montrose House, that the Earl spoke to her again, this time in a voice that was softer, more personal than she had ever heard before. "Miss Merrick," he said, his gaze steady as he helped her into the carriage. "What happened tonight, it won't define you. You proved that to everyone in that room. You are not your past. You are who you choose to be from this moment forward." Rosalind nodded, the weight of his words sinking deep into her. She wasn't the broken girl her mother had sold, nor was she a mere curiosity to be examined by high society. She was something more, something that no one could take away. The carriage began to roll forward, and as the streets of London blurred by, Rosalind felt something shift within her. A quiet determination, a sense of purpose that she hadn't had before. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. As the days continued to unfold at Montrose House, Rosalind began to understand just how much had changed within her. The girl who had once stood in that dark carriage, on the brink of despair, had been transformed into a woman capable of walking the fine line between society's expectations and her own desires. Lady Constance's rigorous training, the late nights, the countless lessons in etiquette, languages, and social interaction, it had all been worth it. She could feel the confidence in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she held herself in a room full of strangers. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel out of place. The ball was behind her now, but the whispers about her mother's scandalous entrance had faded into nothing more than background noise. The season had moved on, and she was no longer just the poor physician's daughter who had been sold into degradation. She was Rosalind Merrick, a woman who had proven her worth, who had fought and won a place for herself in the aristocracy. But even as the world around her seemed to accept her, Rosalind couldn't ignore the nagging doubts that lingered. Had she truly changed, or had she simply learned to fit into a world that demanded conformity? Was her dignity the result of her own strength, or had she become a mere reflection of the expectations placed upon her? One evening, as she sat in the grand drawing room of Montrose House, Adrian entered, his usual composed demeanor slightly shifted. There was something in his eyes that Rosalind couldn't quite place, something raw, something real. He paused at the door, as if unsure whether to approach her. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the air thick with the unspoken. Finally he spoke. "You've done well, Rosalind. You've come so far, and I'm proud of you. But there's still one more thing I need to ask." Rosalind's heart skipped. She had been prepared for tests of her character, her knowledge, her grace. But this? She wasn't ready for this. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. He crossed the room slowly, taking a seat beside her. "I've watched you grow, and in the process, I've found myself feeling something more for you than I ever expected. Something I didn't know was possible. But I know you have doubts. I can see it in your eyes. You've been trained to be the perfect lady, but I wonder if the woman I've come to care for is truly the woman you want to be." His words were like a weight lifting off her chest, a moment of clarity in a life that had been so full of confusion. "You think I'm just pretending?" she asked softly, the question barely audible. I think you've been pretending to be someone you're not, he replied, his voice just as quiet. And I think you're afraid that, if you choose to stay, you'll be trapped in a life that isn't truly yours. Rosalind looked at him, her mind racing. The fear, the pressure, the weight of the past months. It all came rushing back. And what if I've lost who I am in all of this? She whispered. What if I've become someone else? Adrian reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The woman I see in front of me, he said, his tone sincere, is a woman who has fought for her place in this world, who has shown incredible strength and resilience. But she's not someone who needs to hide behind a mask anymore. You don't have to be what society expects you to be. You don't have to be perfect, Rosalind. You just have to be yourself. The simplicity of his words struck her deeply. He wasn't asking her to conform, to fit into the rigid mold of a lady. He was asking her to be real, to embrace her true self, no matter what the world might say. It was a freedom she hadn't known she was capable of. I don't know if I can do that, Rosalind admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know if I'm strong enough to walk away from everything I've worked for. You're stronger than you think, Adrian said gently. And whatever you choose, I will support you. But I can't do it for you. The choice has to be yours. For the first time in her life, Rosalind felt the weight of true freedom. It was terrifying, yet exhilarating. She had spent so long trying to please others, trying to prove her worth. But now, she had the chance to define herself. Not as the daughter of a physician, not as the woman who had been sold, but as Rosalind Merrick, a woman with her own future to shape. And as the night wore on, Rosalind made a decision. The next day, Lady Constance called for her. There was no fanfare, no grand declaration, just a simple request to speak. Rosalind entered the room with the same composure she had spent months perfecting. But today something was different. She wasn't the woman she had been when she first walked through Montrose's doors. She had learned the rules, yes, but she had also learned something more important. How to break them when they no longer served her. Lady Constance, Rosalind said, her voice clear and unwavering. I have made my decision. I cannot marry Adrian, because I am not yet sure of who I am. I need time, space, and the freedom to figure that out on my own. I choose to go, to live independently, and to continue the work my father started. I will use the £2,000 to establish my own practice, and contribute to the medical community as I was always meant to.